Argentina, a land of pampas and passion, of gauchos, tango, football and political drama so operatic it makes Italian opera look like a Sunday lullaby. It is a country that has produced both Jorge Luis Borges and Diego Maradona, both Evita Perón and Lionel Messi, and one suspects, given half a chance, could produce 3 more of each before breakfast. It is a place where literature, politics and sport spill into one another, where a football match can feel like a revolution and a revolution can feel like a tango. But before we gallop ahead into revolutions and football stadiums, let's drift slowly back, because Argentina's story, like all good bedtime stories, begins long before the headlines and the anthems. It begins with the first humans to wander its vast plains, leaving behind tools, cave paintings, and the faint traces of societies long gone. At Cueva de las Manos in Patagonia, you can still see the outlines of hands stenciled in red and black, painted thousands of years ago. A prehistoric high five, if you like. And if you want to go back further still, Argentina offers you a trump card. Long before humans, long before cities or even cave painters, Argentina was home to some of the largest dinosaurs the world has ever seen. Patagonia has yielded fossils of Argentinosaurus, a creature so vast it stretched over 30 meters, longer than a Boeing 737. It lumbered across the land 90 million years ago, munching its way through ancient forests. Then there was Giganotosaurus, a predator so large it could have given Tyrannosaurus rex a run for its money. These giants were gone millions of years before a single human set foot in South America. But it does mean Argentina can claim bragging rights. It has always been a land of giants. From dinosaurs to footballers, you might say. Back in the human timeline, Argentina was, and is, a country of abundance. The name itself comes from the Latin argentum, silver. Early Spanish explorers, dazzled by tales of a Sierra del Plata, imagined this land brimming with treasure. They were wrong about the silver, but they were right about the richness. Argentina's wealth would be measured not in glittering metal, but in soil. Fertile plains, the Pampas, stretching endlessly and producing grain and cattle in such abundance that, for a time, Argentina was called the world's granary. A land so abundant that steak and wine would become not just food, but symbols of identity. And yet, richness brings rivalry. From the very beginning, Argentina was shaped by tension. Between city and countryside, between indigenous peoples and colonizers, between European immigrants and Creole elites, between the dream of unity and the reality of division. These tensions would spark wars, coups, and political melodramas, though always, it must be said, with a certain style. What we have here, then, is the story of a nation at once European and American, torn between old empires and new dreams. The Spaniards arrived and left their language, their religion, and their bureaucracy. But Argentina was also a magnet for Italians, Germans, Syrians, Jews, and later the British, all of whom helped shape the national character. Walk down the streets of Buenos Aires and you'll hear Spanish spoken with an Italian lilt. See Parisian-style boulevards lined with cafes, and feel a pride that is unmistakably Argentine. It is the story of Pampas grasslands stretching further than the eye can see, of indigenous peoples resisting conquest, of Gauchos, those romantic horse-riding figures of the plains, living lives of freedom that became a national myth. It is the story of immigrants stepping off ships at the docks of Buenos Aires with little more than hope in their pockets, determined to build a life in a land that promised opportunity. And it is the story of politicians who could inspire adoration one moment and despair the next. Some treated like saints, others cursed like villains, though often they were a bit of both. Argentina has always balanced on the knife edge of contradiction. It has been rich and poor, united and divided, democratic and dictatorial, a nation of extraordinary promise and deep crises. The 20th century saw it veer from being one of the richest countries on earth to one battling debt, inflation, and military juntas. And yet, somehow, it has never lost its swagger, its pride, or its belief that greatness lies just around the corner. If you're lying in bed now, eyelids heavy, let this tale wash gently over you. We'll take it century by century, revolution by revolution, goal by goal. We'll meet San Martin, the general who freed South America from Spanish rule. Rosas, the iron-fisted Caudillo who ruled with both fear and flair. Evita, whose charisma turned politics into theatre. And Maradona, who turned football into poetry. Don't worry if you drift away halfway through a chapter. Argentina has always been a place of dreams, some realized, some broken, and some that were simply danced into existence on the parquet floors of a tango hall. If history teaches us anything, it's that Argentina is never finished. Its story is always unfolding, always surprising, sometimes tragic, sometimes glorious. And whether you listen to every word tonight, or only the first few minutes before sleep arrives, Argentina will still be here in the morning, waiting for you. So close your eyes, settle back, and let us begin. Before Argentina was Argentina, before Buenos Aires had its boulevards, before Gauchos rode the Pampas, before anyone argued about politics over a steak, it was home to people who left behind stories written not in books, but in stone, bone, and paint. To drift back into that deep past is to find a land already alive with humanity, long before the Spanish ships appeared on the horizon. The earliest inhabitants of what we now call Argentina arrived at least 12,000 years ago, during the tail end of the Ice Age. They were hunters and gatherers, following herds across wide plains and leaving faint traces of their passing. At Monteverde, just across the border in Chile, archaeological sites hint that humans were in South America even earlier, perhaps 14,000 years ago. Argentina, with its diverse landscapes, pampas, mountains, deserts, forests and glaciers, quickly became a mosaic of cultures. One of the most striking windows into this world lies in Patagonia, Cueva de las Manos, the Cave of the Hands. There, on the rocky walls, are stenciled outlines of human hands, painted in red, black and ochre, around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. They look startlingly modern, as if someone has just pressed their palm against the rock and sprayed around it. In fact, they were made by placing a hand on the wall and blowing paint through a bone tube. Alongside the hands are paintings of guanacos, llama-like animals, and hunting scenes, reminders that these early Argentines lived by the chase. If you ever need proof that people thousands of years ago were not so different from us, playful, expressive, eager to leave their mark, Cueva de las Manos is it. As time passed, these early hunter-gatherers diversified. In the northwest, where the Andes sweep into Argentina, farming began. Maize, beans and squash were cultivated, and societies took on a more settled shape. The Diaguita people built fortified villages, terraced hillsides, and crafted fine pottery. They were part of a wider Andean world, influenced by the great civilizations to the north in Peru. When the Inca Empire expanded southward in the 15th century, they incorporated parts of northwest Argentina, bringing their road systems, quipus, knotted cords for record-keeping, and state religion. For a brief moment, Argentina was on the very edge of one of the most sophisticated empires the Americas ever produced. Elsewhere, life looked different. In the Pampas and Patagonia, vast grasslands supported nomadic groups like the Tehuelche, who hunted guanaco and rheas and later adopted the horse after its introduction by Europeans. They lived in small bands, moving with the seasons, their lives tied to the rhythm of the land. Their descendants would later be portrayed, often romantically, sometimes inaccurately, as noble warriors resisting conquest, much as the Gauchos were celebrated for their independence. In the Gran Chaco, the hot, semi-tropical lowlands of the north, lived people such as the Wichi and Quam. They relied on fishing, gathering and small-scale farming, building resilient communities in a challenging environment. In the northeast, closer to the Iguazu Falls, the Guarani cultivated crops and lived in larger, more settled villages. They, too, would later be drawn into the drama of colonization, particularly in the Jesuit missions. What unites these diverse peoples is that they lived without a single overarching state, Argentina. Unlike Mexico or Peru, was not the site of a great empire with monumental cities. There were no pyramids like Teotihuacan, no Cusco or Machu Picchu. Instead, Argentina's indigenous societies were smaller, more fragmented and adapted to a wide range of environments. This, ironically, would make them more vulnerable when European colonizers arrived, for they lacked the centralized armies or institutions that could organize large-scale resistance. Still, we should not underestimate their richness. Archaeologists find finely worked stone tools, pottery painted with geometric designs, and burial sites that show care for the dead. Oral traditions, later recorded by anthropologists, describe cosmologies in which the sun, moon, animals and spirits all played their part. In the Pampas, some peoples believed in a great creator spirit who governed the cycles of life. In the north, myths blended with those of the wider Andean world. Every community, no matter how small, carried a sense of belonging to a landscape they understood intimately. And while we tend to think of history as a list of kings and battles, this quieter, pre-Columbian Argentina is a reminder that most human life has always been lived in the rhythms of everyday survival: planting, harvesting, hunting, raising children, and occasionally painting your hand on a cave wall because, well, why not? When the Spanish finally did arrive in the 16th century, they would encounter this patchwork of societies, some settled, some nomadic, some tied to the Andes, others to the plains or rivers. Conquest would not be simple nor immediate. Resistance lasted centuries, and in some places well into the 19th century. But all of that lies ahead, for now, in our story, Argentina is still a land of many peoples, untroubled by the notion of Argentina itself. It is perhaps fitting, then, that the nation's story begins not with crowns or constitutions, but with hands on a cave wall, reaching out to us across time. As you drift into sleep, imagine those early Argentines gathered around a fire, the air cool and dry, the stars blazing overhead. They speak in languages long since vanished. They sing songs no one has heard in centuries, and yet, in their handprints, we see ourselves. The same urge to say, we were here, we lived, and that, more than silver or conquest, is the true beginning of Argentina. By the early 1500s, Europe was bursting with restless ambition. Christopher Columbus had sailed west and found not the Indies, but a new world. Spanish conquistadors, with armour polished, swords sharpened, and egos inflated to bursting point, were marching across continents. And into this grand story of conquest and curiosity enters Argentina. Not that anyone called it Argentina yet. To the Spaniards, it was still an unknown land at the edge of maps, a place of rivers, plains, and, according to persistent rumour, silver. That rumour is important. The Rio de la Plata, the great estuary where Buenos Aires now sits, was named River of Silver. Spanish explorers believed it was the gateway to a Sierra del Plata, a fabled mountain range overflowing with treasure. Like so many European adventurers, they had gold and silver on the brain. Alas, what they found was less glittering, but far more significant in the long run. The first Spaniard to poke his nose into the estuary was Juan Díaz de Solís in 1516. He sailed bravely into the wide mouth of the Rio de la Plata with a small fleet. It must have looked promising. Broad waters, fertile lands on either side. But Solís's optimism was short-lived. He and several crew members landed, only to be swiftly attacked by indigenous peoples. The details are hazy, but legend has it they were killed and even eaten. Not the glorious conquest Solís had planned. His expedition ended in horror, and his name slipped into the footnotes of history. Yet Spaniards are not easily discouraged. A decade later, another expedition set off, led by Sebastian Cabot, son of the Venetian explorer John Cabot. Cabot made his way inland along the Paraná and Paraguay rivers, hoping to reach the fabled Silver Mountains. He didn't find them either, but he did establish small settlements and forge alliances with some indigenous groups. Still, disease, conflict, and the sheer vastness of the land made his efforts fragile. The real turning point came in 1536, when Pedro de Mendoza arrived with a far larger expedition. He had a royal commission from the Spanish crown to colonize the region, bringing with him around 1,500 settlers, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and the eternally hopeful. He founded a settlement near the mouth of the estuary and named it Nuestra Señora Santa Maria del Buen Aire, Our Lady St. Mary of the Good Air. Yes, Buenos Aires had been born. But the infant city had a rough childhood. Supplies were scarce, relations with local peoples quickly soured, and hunger gnawed at the settlers. Within 5 years, Buenos Aires was abandoned. Survivors trudged north to Asunción, in present-day Paraguay, where conditions were somewhat kinder. So the first Buenos Aires vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. This, by the way, would become something of a theme in Argentine history. Optimism followed by crisis, grand beginnings undone by harsh realities. But don't worry, Buenos Aires would be back, stronger, later in the century. For now, it was a ghost town, a failed experiment. Meanwhile, in the north, the Spanish pressed on. The fertile valleys of the northwest, with indigenous communities already farming and trading, were more attractive than the windswept Pampas. Santiago del Estero, founded in 1553, became the first permanent Spanish settlement in what is now Argentina. It was followed by Córdoba in 1573, Salta in 1582, and Tucumán in between. These towns anchored Spanish presence in the northwest and linked Argentina to the Andean world, which the Spaniards had already conquered in Peru. The Spanish strategy was classic: plant towns, erect churches, and spread out haciendas, large estates worked by indigenous labor. Where persuasion failed, force followed. Resistance was fierce. Indigenous peoples of the Pampas and Patagonia, used to mobile lifestyles, proved especially difficult to subjugate. Their resistance would endure for centuries. In the northwest, communities alternately fought and negotiated with Spanish settlers. But epidemics of smallpox and measles took their toll. Populations collapsed, weakening their ability to resist. Back at the Rio de la Plata, Buenos Aires rose again. In 1580, Juan de Garay, governor of Asunción, led another expedition south. This time, better prepared, he founded a second Buenos Aires on the site of the first. He parceled out land, brought in settlers, and laid the foundations for what would become Argentina's greatest city. From then on, Buenos Aires endured. Not comfortably. It remained a scrappy, vulnerable outpost for decades, but it survived. Now, let's pause for a moment. Spain's empire was designed to funnel riches home. Silver from Bolivia's Potosí mines, sugar from the Caribbean, gold from Mexico, it all flowed across the Atlantic. But Buenos Aires was not in the imperial spotlight. It was a poor cousin, sidelined by colonial trade routes that prioritized Lima in Peru. For centuries, Buenos Aires would feel neglected, smuggling becoming as common as official trade. Argentines, one might say, learned early how to bend the rules. Still, this neglect gave Buenos Aires something of a free-spirited, frontier character. It wasn't wealthy, but it was independent-minded. That independence, faint at first, would later grow into a defining trait. But for now, in the 1500s and 1600s, Argentina was a far-flung corner of the Spanish Empire, sparsely populated, culturally diverse, and often overlooked. Yet out of these unpromising beginnings, a failed city, a scattering of towns, a neglected frontier, the seeds of a nation were sown. Spanish settlers intermarried with indigenous peoples, creating a Creole society. Cattle, introduced by the Spanish, multiplied on the Pampas until they roamed in vast herds, wild and plentiful. Gauchos would later emerge from this environment, those iconic horsemen of the plains. And Buenos Aires, neglected or not, would grow into a port city of consequence. So, if Chapter 1 was a story of painted hands and guanaco hunts, Chapter 2 is the story of ships, swords, and cities, of Spaniards planting their flag and learning, often the hard way, what it meant to survive at the far end of the empire. By the dawn of the 18th century, Argentina had settled into a curious rhythm. It was still a distant outpost of the Spanish Empire, far from the wealth of Mexico's silver or Peru's mines. If the empire were a grand banquet, Argentina was the seat at the far end of the table, where the scraps arrived late, if at all. But scraps can be nourishing if you know how to use them, and Argentines, even in colonial times, were nothing if not inventive. The colony's greatest gift turned out not to be gold or silver, but cattle. The Spaniards had introduced cows and horses in the 16th century. Left to their own devices, these animals multiplied with astonishing enthusiasm. By the 1700s, wild herds roamed the Pampas in their millions. Imagine vast grasslands stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted with cattle, horses, and the occasional rider with a lasso. For Europeans raised on cramped fields and hedgerows, it must have looked like paradise, or perhaps chaos. From this abundance emerged a new figure, the Gaucho. Neither strictly Spanish nor strictly indigenous, Gauchos were frontier horsemen who lived by their wits and their skill in the saddle. dressed in loose bombachas, trousers, wide-brimmed hats and ponchos, armed with knives called facones, they roamed the Pampas hunting cattle, taming horses, and living lives of freedom that became the stuff of legend. Later poets and politicians would romanticize them as the true Argentines, rugged individualists embodying the spirit of the land. In truth, many gauchos were poor, mixed-race men scraping a living on the margins. But myth has its own power, and the gaucho myth would shape Argentine identity for centuries. The economy of the Pampas was based on hides. Leather, not beef, was the great export of the 18th century. Cattle were slaughtered not for steaks, surprisingly those came later, but for their skins, which were salted, stacked, and shipped across the Atlantic. The meat was often left to rot or consumed locally in great barbecues. Europe demanded leather for saddles, belts, and shoes, and Argentina supplied it in abundance. Buenos Aires, once a struggling outpost, began to thrive on this trade. Officially, Spain still wanted its colonies to trade through Lima and Seville, but in practice, smuggling flourished. British and Portuguese ships appeared in the estuary, exchanging manufactured goods for hides. The city's merchants grew wealthy, and Buenos Aires developed a taste for independence, and for ignoring Madrid when it suited them. One could say Argentina's rebellious streak was nourished by contraband leather. But it wasn't all gauchos and smugglers. In the northeast, the Jesuits built their famous missions among the Guarani people. Starting in the 17th century, but reaching their height in the 18th, these missions were religious, economic, and social experiments. Jesuit priests gathered indigenous communities into organized towns, introduced European farming techniques, and taught music, crafts, and literacy. The missions became remarkably successful, producing goods, exporting yerba mate, that bitter herbal tea so beloved in Argentina today, and creating a unique fusion of European and indigenous culture. Visitors were astonished by the orchestras and choirs of the missions, where Guarani musicians played violins, harps, and flutes with great skill. To some, the missions seemed a utopia, communities protected from exploitation by colonial settlers. To others, particularly colonial authorities, they were suspiciously independent. When the Spanish crown expelled the Jesuits in 1767, the missions declined, their people scattered. But their memory lingers, both in the ruins that still stand in Misiones province and in the deep cultural threads of Argentine society. Meanwhile, the Northwest tied Argentina more firmly to the Andean world. Towns like Córdoba and Salta thrived as regional centers, producing textiles and serving as way stations for trade caravans. Pack mules carried goods across mountain passes, linking Argentina with Peru and Bolivia. Here, the colonial order looked more traditional. Wealthy Creole families, indigenous labor, and the church at the center of life. And then, in 1776, a change of enormous consequence. The Spanish crown created the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, with Buenos Aires as its capital. At last, Buenos Aires was recognized as a major center, no longer a neglected outpost. The new viceroyalty included modern Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. This meant more autonomy, more trade, and more prestige. For Buenos Aires merchants, it was vindication. Their smuggling days had prepared them well for official prosperity. Still, the late 1700s brought tension. Spain's empire was weakening. Wars in Europe drained resources. British ships hovered, eager for trade or conquest. Local elites in Buenos Aires grew wealthier and more self-confident, increasingly resentful of Madrid's interference. And gauchos, still roaming the Pampas, became symbols of freedom, celebrated in song and story. A national identity, fragile and embryonic, was taking shape. So the colonial economy of Argentina was never about gold or silver as Solis or Mendoza might have dreamed. It was about cattle and hides, gauchos and Jesuits, smuggling and ships, and the gradual rise of Buenos Aires from backwater to capital. This foundation, resource-rich, outward-looking, self-willed, would shape everything that followed. As you close your eyes and drift, imagine the scent of leather curing in the sun, the sound of a gaucho's guitar by a campfire, the clatter of hooves across the Pampas. Argentina in the 1700s was already alive with character, a land learning the arts of survival, independence, and style. By the turn of the 19th century, Argentina was still officially a loyal province of the Spanish Empire. Buenos Aires bustled with trade, gauchos roamed the Pampas, and the church bells rang out with reassuring regularity. But across the Atlantic, things were falling apart for Spain. Napoleon Bonaparte, that short Corsican with tall ambitions, had invaded the Iberian Peninsula, toppled the Spanish king, and left the empire wobbling like a flan in an earthquake. In Buenos Aires, local elites were watching closely. For years they had chafed under Madrid's restrictions, grumbling that their hides and wheat deserved freer trade, and their city more respect. Now, with Spain in chaos, the moment seemed ripe for something daring. The first test came in 1806, when the British, never ones to miss a chance for opportunism, decided to have a go at invading. They landed in Buenos Aires, expecting the locals to welcome them with tea and sympathy. Instead, they were chased out by militias led by Santiago de Liniers, a Frenchman in Spanish service. In 1807, the British tried again, with more troops. Once more, Buenos Aires rose, driving them into the sea. These victories were extraordinary. A colonial city defeating the world's greatest naval power. They gave porteños, residents of Buenos Aires, a swaggering confidence. If we can beat the British, they thought, why not Spain? So, in May 1810, while Napoleon's brother Joseph sat uneasily on the Spanish throne, Buenos Aires made its move. Crowds gathered in the Plaza de la Victoria, now Plaza de Mayo, demanding self-government. After days of tense debate, the Spanish viceroy was forced out, and a local junta took power. This was the famous May Revolution. Fireworks were set off, proclamations issued, and for the first time, Buenos Aires was governed not from Madrid, but from its own cabildo. It wasn't yet full independence, but the genie was out of the bottle. The years that followed were a blur of battles, manifestos, and political arguments shouted in smoky rooms. Some provinces supported Buenos Aires, others mistrusted its arrogance. Federalists wanted more autonomy for the regions. Unitarians wanted a strong central government. The seeds of future civil wars were already being sown. But for the moment, the overriding goal was independence from Spain. Enter José de San Martín. A career soldier who had trained in Spain, he returned to his homeland in 1812 with a quiet determination and a magnificent set of sideburns. Unlike some of his contemporaries who enjoyed long speeches, San Martín preferred action. He founded the Army of the Andes, a disciplined force that would attempt the impossible, crossing the Andes Mountains to liberate Chile. Imagine thousands of men, mules, and cannons trudging through icy passes, with snow blizzards biting their faces and frost nipping their toes. Many thought it madness. But in early 1817, they emerged on the other side, battered but ready. At Chacabuco, they smashed the royalist forces, opening the way to Chile's independence. San Martin wasn't done. From Chile, he launched an expedition by sea to Peru, the very heart of Spanish power in South America. In 1821, he entered Lima and declared Peruvian independence. A statesman as well as a soldier, San Martin knew his limits. Rather than fight rival liberator Simón Bolívar for glory, he stepped aside, leaving Bolívar to finish the job. It was an act of humility rare in history, and Argentina still remembers him as the great liberator. Statues of him, usually on horseback, can be found in every city square. Back in Argentina, however, things were messy. While San Martin fought abroad, at home the new nation was tearing itself apart. Rival factions bickered over the constitution, the role of Buenos Aires, and the balance between provinces. Caudillos, strongmen with regional power bases, began to emerge, draped in ponchos and supported by Gaucho militias. The dream of a united republic was proving complicated. And yet, despite the quarrels and the chaos, something irreversible had happened. Argentina had slipped the leash of Spain. By 1816, in the Congress of Tucumán, independence was formally declared. Delegates signed the act beneath a simple roof in a modest house that is still preserved today. No grand palace, no Versailles-style hall, just creaking floorboards and determined faces. From such humble rooms are nations born. The wars of independence were not clean nor easy. They brought bloodshed, division and uncertainty, but they also brought a new sense of possibility. Argentina was no longer a forgotten province at the edge of an empire. It was a nation in the making, with heroes to inspire it, arguments to animate it, and plenty of unfinished business. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture San Martin's army winding its way up icy slopes, the wind howling, men clutching their ponchos tight. Picture Buenos Aires crowds cheering in the plaza, while merchants smuggle hides and politicians argue. This was Argentina's adolescence, noisy, ambitious, rebellious, and utterly determined to be free. Independence, as it turned out, was the easy part. Kicking out Spain had been a messy affair, but at least everyone could agree on the basic goal. Down with the viceroy, long live Argentina. What came next was trickier, deciding what Argentina actually was. Should it be a strong, centralized state dominated by Buenos Aires, with its merchants, port and swagger? Or a loose federation of provinces, each jealously guarding its autonomy, led by local strongmen with splendid moustaches and even more splendid egos? Thus began a long, wearying cycle of civil wars that would stretch across the first half of the 19th century. The two sides were known as Unitarians and Federalists. The Unitarians, based largely in Buenos Aires, favoured a strong central government, free trade, and a modernising, European-facing outlook. The Federalists, spread across the provinces, demanded local autonomy and often leaned on rural traditions and Gaucho militias. It was less about ideology than about geography and power. Buenos Aires versus everyone else. Into this fractious world strode the Caudillos. These were regional warlords, charismatic and terrifying in equal measure, who commanded loyalty through personal authority, patronage, and a healthy dose of violence. They draped themselves in ponchos, rode at the head of Gaucho cavalry, and inspired either devotion or dread. Caudillos were not so much politicians as embodiments of local power, half folk heroes, half tyrants. The most famous, or infamous, of them all was Juan Manuel de Rosas. Born into a wealthy ranching family, Rosas had the manners of an aristocrat and the instincts of a gaucho. He built his power on vast cattle estancias and on his ability to command gaucho militias. By the late 1820s, he had risen to dominate Buenos Aires and, from there, much of Argentina. Rosas ruled with an iron hand wrapped in a blood-red ribbon, literally. He demanded loyalty symbols. Every citizen had to wear a red badge of allegiance to the Federalist cause. Those who didn't were suspected of treason. He employed the feared mazorca, a secret police force that intimidated, tortured, and sometimes murdered opponents. Newspapers praised him as the restorer of the laws. Critics whispered of tyranny. He was both adored and hated, feared and celebrated. Yet Rosas also stabilized Argentina, at least temporarily. He defended Buenos Aires against foreign threats, including French and British blockades, and he upheld Argentina's sovereignty in an era when European powers were sniffing around South America like wolves at the door. He was, in a sense, Argentina's first strong national ruler, but one whose methods left scars. Meanwhile, the provinces simmered with rebellion. The Unitarians never disappeared, constantly plotting comebacks. Civil wars flared, alliances shifted, and gaucho cavalry thundered across the Pampas. To live in 19th century Argentina was to live in a permanent state of uncertainty. Today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy, and yesterday's villain might ride back as today's hero. Culture reflected this turbulence. Gauchos became symbols of both resistance and authenticity. In 1872, long after the fact, José Hernández would publish Martín Fierro, an epic poem celebrating the gaucho's life, struggles, and defiance of authority. But even before Hernández, the gaucho was a living presence, a man of the frontier, caught between loyalty to Caudillos and his own fierce independence. By the 1850s, Rosas's rule had begun to falter. His enemies gathered, provinces united against him, and in 1852, at the Battle of Caseros, his forces were decisively defeated. Rosas fled into exile in England, where he spent his final years quietly farming. A curious retirement for a man who once demanded absolute obedience from millions. Argentina, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces and attempt, once again, to forge unity out of division. The era of civil wars and caudillos was a messy adolescence for Argentina. It left deep divisions between Buenos Aires and the provinces, between Federalists and Unitarians, between the dream of modernization and the reality of personal rule. But it also gave Argentina its first taste of national politics, its first experiments with unity, and its enduring myths of gaucho freedom and strongman authority. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the flicker of campfires on the Pampas, the silhouettes of gaucho cavalry under the moonlight, and the red badges pinned defiantly to jackets in Buenos Aires. It was an Argentina of passion and violence, of loyalty and betrayal. A country not yet fully formed, but already unmistakably itself. By the 1860s, Argentina was finally, tentatively finding its feet. The civil wars of the early 19th century had left the nation blooded and divided, but also wiser, or at least weary enough of chaos to try something new. The dream now was of unity, order and modernity, a constitution, a capital, railways, and perhaps even some peace and prosperity, if they could manage it. The first step came in 1853, when a constitution was drafted at Santa Fe. Modelled partly on the United States Constitution, it promised a federal republic with checks, balances, and all the usual hopeful trimmings. It enshrined rights, divided powers, and declared Argentina open for business. There was, of course, one snag. Buenos Aires refused to sign. Typical Buenos Aires. Proud, wealthy, and determined not to share too much with the provinces. For several years the city stood apart, like a sulking child at a family gathering. Only after further conflict and the eventual defeat of Buenos Aires forces in 1861 did the capital finally rejoin the national fold. Once united, more or less, Argentina embarked on a remarkable transformation. Railways were laid, financed by eager British investors. Gleaming steel tracks spread across the Pampas, linking Buenos Aires to Rosario, Córdoba and beyond. For ranchers, this meant they could now send beef and grain to market quickly and profitably. For immigrants, it meant a ticket from the docks straight into the interior, where land and opportunity beckoned. For Gauchos, it meant the end of their wild independence, as fences carved up the open plains and cattle were no longer hunted but managed on orderly estancias. Romantic as the Gaucho myth was, the age of the cowboy drifter was giving way to the age of the ranch baron. Immigration was the great story of the era. Argentina flung open its doors, promising land and opportunity, and Europe responded. Italians poured in, soon forming the largest immigrant group. Spaniards came too, as well as Germans, French, and Eastern Europeans. By the late 19th century, Buenos Aires had become one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth, with opera houses, cafes, and a babble of accents on every street corner. The Italian influence was especially strong. Pasta and pizza became staples, Italian gestures crept into Argentine Spanish, and tango itself would carry a distinct Neapolitan lilt. Economically, Argentina boomed. Beef and wheat flowed out of Buenos Aires, destined for European tables. Refrigerated ships, a technological marvel of the late 19th century, made it possible to export fresh meat rather than just hides. Suddenly, Argentina was not a forgotten backwater, but a rising star of the global economy. Politicians boasted that the country was destined for greatness, perhaps even to rival the United States. But there was a darker side. The expansion of estancias and railways came at the expense of indigenous peoples. In the 1870s and 1880s, the Argentine state launched the Conquest of the Desert, a military campaign to seize control of Patagonia and the southern Pampas. Generals, backed by modern rifles and railroads, advanced into territories long held by the Mapuche, Tehuelche and others. The campaign was brutal. Entire communities were displaced, decimated or absorbed. Buenos Aires newspapers hailed it as progress. Today, many Argentines remember it as dispossession. The land was won, but at a terrible human cost. Meanwhile, politics in Buenos Aires took on a more polished air. Presidents like Bartolomé Mitre, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, and Nicolás Avellaneda were nation builders in the truest sense. Men of letters as well as leaders, fond of schools, libraries, and rail timetables. Sarmiento, in particular, was obsessed with education, declaring that to govern is to educate. He oversaw the building of hundreds of schools, convinced that the key to Argentina's future lay not just in cattle, but in classrooms. He was probably right. By the 1880s, Argentina was beginning to look startlingly modern. Buenos Aires was nicknamed the Paris of South America, with grand boulevards and French-inspired architecture. Wealthy families sent their children to study in Europe, dressed in the latest fashions, and spent their evenings at the opera. The Pampas supplied the riches, the immigrants supplied the labour, and Buenos Aires supplied the swagger. And yet contradictions lingered. The gap between rich estancieros, landowners, and poor labourers was wide. Indigenous peoples had been pushed aside. Gauchos had been romanticised in poetry, even as their real way of life was fenced out of existence. Argentina was modernising, yes, but on terms that left some winners and many losers. Still, there was an undeniable sense of momentum. The 19th century was closing with Argentina firmly on the global map. Its cattle fed Europe, its wheat filled ships, its population soared with immigrants, and its cities gleamed with European style. From the chaos of Caudillos, Argentina had reinvented itself as a modern nation. The dream of greatness seemed within reach. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine the hiss of a steam engine cutting across the Pampas, the clatter of hooves replaced by the whistle of trains. Picture immigrants stepping off ships, gazing up at the boulevards of Buenos Aires with hope and awe. Argentina, once a neglected outpost, was now a land of promise. Though, as always, promise would come with its own price. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Argentina was living its dream. The cattle, the wheat, the railways, the immigrants, all the pieces had fallen into place. Buenos Aires was no longer a provincial port with muddy streets, but a glittering metropolis, hailed in travel brochures as the Paris of South America. Opera houses, cafes, and grand avenues sprouted like mushrooms after rain. It was the Belle Époque, the beautiful age, and Argentina was determined to look its best. The wealth was staggering. Beef and grain exports soared, fueled by refrigerated ships that carried Argentine produce straight to European markets. Britain, in particular, was delighted. Its industrial cities could eat Argentine beef, while its investors collected dividends from Argentine railways. Buenos Aires bankers, estancieros, and politicians lived in palaces modelled on French mansions, complete with chandeliers, imported marble, and French governesses for the children. To stroll along Avenida de Mayo or gaze up at the newly opened Teatro Colón was to feel that Buenos Aires had vaulted straight into the ranks of world cities. The theatre itself was a monument to ambition. Opened in 1908, it rivaled any opera house in Europe, with acoustics so perfect that tenors feared their every note might be heard too clearly. Immigration continued at a furious pace. Italians poured in, soon joined by Spaniards, Russians, Jews and Syrians. Between 1880 and 1914, millions arrived, transforming Argentina's demographics. Entire neighbourhoods in Buenos Aires rang with Neapolitan dialect, Galician songs or Yiddish prayers. The city's Spanish acquired its distinctive sing-song intonation, flavoured with Italian vowels. It was, quite literally, a nation being built by newcomers. The scale was extraordinary. Between 1880 and 1914, Argentina received more immigrants relative to its population than the United States. they arrived at the docks of La Boca, trudging with suitcases and bundles, eyes wide as they gazed at the forest of cranes and warehouses. For many, Argentina was an escape from poverty or persecution. For others, it was a chance to own land. Some struck it lucky, buying estancias or small plots in the provinces. Many more laboured in factories or loaded ships at the docks, squeezed into cramped conventillos, tenement houses where families shared tiny rooms around a common courtyard. It was here, in these bustling, noisy courtyards, that the culture of modern Argentina was forged. And then there was tango. Born in the working-class districts, tango was the music of immigrants, prostitutes and night owls. It blended African rhythms, Italian melodies and Criollo guitar strums into something entirely new. At first, polite society sniffed, too sensual, too vulgar, too full of longing. But tango had a way of insinuating itself, creeping out of brothels and dockside bars into dance halls and cafes. By the early 20th century, it had conquered Paris, and once Paris embraced it, Buenos Aires elites suddenly discovered a deep and patriotic love for it. Nothing says success like exporting your disreputable dance to European aristocrats. Tango was not just a dance, but a metaphor for the age. Born of mixture, heavy with longing, and always performed in pairs, a dialogue of attraction and resistance. Its lyrics spoke of love and betrayal, of exile and memory, themes that resonated with immigrants who had left families behind across the ocean. If the Belle Époque had a soundtrack, tango was it. While tango swept through the barrios, the gaucho passed from reality into myth. By 1900, the open Pampas were largely fenced, and ranching had become an orderly business. The gaucho was no longer roaming free, but in literature he was immortalized. José Hernández's Martín Fierro, published in the 1870s, was embraced as a national epic, portraying the gaucho as Argentina's tragic hero, noble and wronged by authority. Schools taught it, intellectuals debated it, and artists painted it. In the drawing rooms of Buenos Aires, the gaucho became a symbol of Argentine authenticity, even as the real gaucho lived out his days as a hired hand, ranch hand, or vanished into obscurity. The divide between rich and poor grew sharper. The generation of 80, the political elite who dominated Argentine politics, prided themselves on order and progress. They built railways, sponsored universities, and cultivated ties with Europe. They also rigged elections, controlled power tightly, and treated the working classes with paternalistic disdain. Strikes broke out as immigrant workers demanded shorter hours, better pay, and safer conditions. The elite, who liked to quote French philosophers over fine cognac, were less enthusiastic when workers quoted Marx and Bakunin back at them. Violence sometimes followed. Anarchist bombing shook Buenos Aires. Police cracked down hard. Yet Argentina was changing. In 1912, the Sáenz-Peña law introduced secret and compulsory voting for men, breaking the elite's stranglehold on politics. Suddenly, new parties representing middle and working classes had a chance. The age of oligarchic control was ending, even if the oligarchs hadn't quite realized it. Still, the Belle Époque was a period of genuine splendor. Argentina's economy ranked among the world's top 10. Visitors marveled at the glittering avenues, the endless pampas, the confidence of a nation that seemed destined for greatness. Writers like Ricardo Giraldes, artists like Benito Quinquela Martin, and musicians in smoky cafes gave the country a cultural vitality to match its economic boom. Yet beneath the chandeliers and tango melodies, lay fragility. The economy was heavily dependent on European demand for beef and wheat. Wealth was unevenly distributed. Political reform was fragile, and across the Atlantic, storm clouds gathered as Europe marched toward war in 1914. The beautiful age would not last forever. The Belle Époque, then, was Argentina at its most dazzling and its most deceptive. A country convinced its future was boundless, even as it sowed the seeds of future discontent. But for a moment, a glorious, fleeting moment, Argentina shone like few other nations on earth. As Europe stumbled into the First World War in 1914, Argentina found itself in an unusual position. It was far from the trenches, spared the mud and the shells, yet deeply entangled through trade. The belligerents needed food, and Argentina, with its vast Pampas and refrigerated ships, was only too happy to oblige. Beef, grain and leather sailed across the Atlantic, and the Argentine economy boomed. Farmers bought land, merchants bought mansions, and Buenos Aires continued to shine. But war also brought disruption. Shipping lanes were dangerous, credit was uncertain, and global markets jittered. Argentina stayed neutral, a decision that frustrated both Britain and Germany, but kept Argentine ships relatively safe. Neutrality also reflected the country's sense of independence. Argentina would not simply take orders from Europe. The war years underscored Argentina's dual identity. On the one hand, it was deeply tied to Europe, culturally, economically, and socially. On the other, it was determined to assert its own sovereignty, to be a player on the world stage in its own right. That tension would mark much of the 20th century. The 1920s were, at first, a time of confidence. With the Sáenz-Peña law in place, elections became more genuine, and the Radical Civic Union, UCR, led by Hipólito Yrigoyen, came to power. Yrigoyen was a curious figure, shy, ascetic and reclusive. He often governed from his modest home, receiving delegations in his slippers. Yet he became a symbol of popular democracy, appealing to the middle and working classes. His presidency was far from perfect. Corruption and inefficiency plagued his government, but it marked a shift away from elite oligarchic rule. Meanwhile, Argentina's economy continued to ride the export wave. In the cafes of Buenos Aires, jazz mingled with tango, while immigrants' children filled universities and dreamed of careers beyond the docks. The city was a vibrant mix of old-world elegance and new-world energy. Visitors still marveled at its boulevards, opera houses, and crowded tenements, predicting a boundless future. And then came the crash. In 1929, Wall Street collapsed, and with it went Argentina's golden run. The Great Depression hit hard. Demand for beef and grain plummeted, exports shrank, and unemployment soared. Breadlines appeared, strikes erupted, and political discontent grew. The dream of endless prosperity shattered like a dropped crystal goblet. In 1930, the military struck. General José Félix Uriburu led a coup ousting Yrigoyen. It was Argentina's first coup, and, sadly, not its last. Thus began the Década Infame, the infamous decade. Governments ruled through electoral fraud, repression, and backroom deals. Corruption was rife, politics cynical, and faith in democracy eroded. The military and conservative elites kept a tight grip, while ordinary Argentines struggled through economic hardship. Yet, even in the infamous decade, change was brewing. Industrialization slowly gathered pace, fueled by the need to rely less on volatile exports. Workers moved into factories, creating a new urban working class. They would soon find their champion. Enter Juan Domingo Perón. A rising army officer with a keen sense of politics, Perón gained prominence during the 1943 military coup that ended the infamous decade. From a position in the Labour Department, he cultivated ties with trade unions, championing workers' rights, better wages, and social benefits. He had charisma, ambition, and a knack for connecting with the masses. And then came Eva Duarte, Evita, an actress with a flair for the dramatic and a fierce determination. She met Perón in 1944. Their partnership was electric. Evita brought glamour, passion, and a direct connection to the poor, especially women. Together, they crafted a new political movement that promised dignity for workers and a proud, independent Argentina. By the mid-1940s, Perón's popularity surged. Workers filled the streets, chanting his name, demanding his release when rivals tried to sideline him. The most famous moment came on October 17, 1945, when masses of workers, the descamisados, the shirtless ones, flooded Buenos Aires to demand Perón's freedom. The sight was extraordinary. Tens of thousands packing the Plaza de Mayo, waving, shouting, singing. It was not just a demonstration, it was a declaration that Argentine politics had changed forever. In 1946, Perón was elected president. With Evita at his side, he began to reshape Argentina. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, the period from 1914 to 1945 was one of dazzling highs and crushing lows. Wartime booms, democratic experiments, economic collapse, cynical coups, and the rise of a movement that would dominate Argentine politics for generations. Argentina was no longer just the Paris of South America. It was carving its own uniquely dramatic path into the modern world. In 1946, Argentina stood at a crossroads. The oligarchs of the infamous decade were gone, swept aside by the wave of workers who had filled the Plaza de Mayo in October 1945 to demand their champion's release. In their place strode a new political force, Juan Domingo Perón and Eva Duarte, better known and better loved as Evita. Together, they dominated Argentine politics with such magnetism, such flair, that even their fiercest critics had to admit politics had become theatre, and the Peróns were the stars of the show. Juan Perón himself was an unlikely revolutionary. A career military officer, he was methodical, disciplined, and pragmatic. His genius lay in sensing the mood of the people and placing himself at its centre. He promised something different from both capitalism and communism, a third position tailored for Argentina. He called it Peronism, and though its meaning would shift with every retelling, at its heart it was about dignity for workers, sovereignty for the nation, and a paternal bond between leader and people. But it was Evita who gave Peronism its soul. Born in 1919, the illegitimate daughter of a provincial rancher, she grew up poor, stigmatized, and determined. At 15, she moved to Buenos Aires, chasing dreams of acting. She worked in radio, film, and theatre, climbing slowly but persistently. Meeting Perón at a charity gala in 1944 changed everything. She recognized his ambition. He recognized her charisma, and together they became unstoppable. When Perón was briefly imprisoned in 1945, it was Evita who rallied the workers, urging them to march. The descamisados, the shirtless ones, factory hands and labourers, poured into Buenos Aires. Their mass protest forced Perón's release, a moment later enshrined as Loyalty Day. It was proof that the Peróns could command the streets as no one else could. Once in office in 1946, Perón launched a sweeping programme. Wages rose, working hours were shortened, paid holidays expanded. Social security extended to millions. Railways, utilities and key industries were nationalised. The state invested heavily in housing, schools and hospitals. Argentina, enriched by wartime reserves, seemed capable of remaking itself as a modern industrial power. Evita became the visible face of these reforms. Through the Eva Perón Foundation, she distributed food, clothes, scholarships and housing. She opened orphanages, hospitals and women's homes. Her foundation's offices were besieged daily by the poor, who lined up to plead their cases, confident Evita would listen. She did, sometimes literally grabbing a pen and scribbling orders to ensure a child got a bed or a widow a pension. Was it charity or politics? Both, seamlessly. For her followers, she was the embodiment of compassion in a society that had long ignored them. And then came her crusade for women's suffrage. Argentina was late to the party. New Zealand had enfranchised women in 1893, Britain partially in 1918, the US in 1920. But Evita pushed relentlessly. In 1947, the law passed, and in 1951, women voted nationwide for the first time. Many cast their ballots for Perón, a tribute to Evita's campaigning. She also founded the Peronist Women's Party, mobilizing women as a political force. In one stroke, half the nation entered politics, and Evita was hailed as their champion. Yet Peronism was never only about policy. It was also performance, ritual and myth. Rallies at the Plaza de Mayo were choreographed spectacles, with banners proclaiming loyalty, songs praising Perón, and Evita speaking in fiery tones. Radio broadcasts beamed their voices into every home. School children learned hymns not just to the flag, but to the leaders. Critics spoke of authoritarianism, even of personality cults. Supporters spoke of love, devotion, and national unity. Not everyone adored them. The elite despised Perón's populism and Evita's scorn for oligarchs. Intellectuals worried about censorship and repression. The Catholic Church bristled at being overshadowed. Opposition parties, where they survived, accused Perón of building a dictatorship. But the descamisados loved him, and they loved Evita even more. In their eyes she was their saint, their voice, their hope. And then, in 1951, tragedy struck. Evita, still only in her early 30s, was diagnosed with advanced cervical cancer. She grew frail, gaunt and pale, yet refused to withdraw. Wrapped in furs, propped up with morphine, she appeared at rallies, her voice still sharp, her passion undimmed. At the 1951 presidential campaign, she addressed crowds from the balcony of the Casa Rosada, her body wasting, but her spirit blazing. She was carried, literally, on a throne-like chair to the stage, a queen of suffering. The nation prayed, begged, despaired. When she died in July 1952, at just 33, Argentina plunged into mourning. Millions filed past her coffin. Women wept, men fainted, children clutched flowers. The grief was overwhelming, almost operatic. For her followers, she had transcended mortality. She was Santa Evita, canonized not by Rome, but by the people. Her body, embalmed, became another chapter of legend. Plans for a grand mausoleum were halted by political turmoil. When Perón was overthrown in 1955, her corpse was seized, hidden, smuggled abroad, and moved in secrecy for years. It would not return to Argentina until the 1970s, by which time Evita was not merely a memory, but a myth, woven into the nation's soul. Perón, without Evita, struggled. Inflation rose, reserves dwindled, and opposition hardened. The Catholic Church turned openly hostile, condemning his cult of personality. The military, suspicious and restless, plotted. Bombs exploded in Buenos Aires, unrest spread, and in 1955 the coup came. Perón fled into exile, eventually finding refuge in Spain, where he lived in relative comfort, awaiting his chance to return. And so the Perón era of 1946 to 1955 ended. But not really, for Peronism was never merely a decade of government. It was a movement, an identity, a lens through which Argentines would view politics forever after. Supporters saw it as dignity restored to the poor. Opponents saw it as demagoguery and repression. But love or loathe, one thing was certain. Peronism had changed Argentina irrevocably. The years of Perón and Evita were years of passion and theatre, of reform and repression, of hope and heartbreak. They were years in which politics became personal, leaders became icons, and Argentina, for a moment, seemed united in devotion, until the divisions tore through once more. When Juan Domingo Perón was bundled out of Argentina in 1955, it was with all the indignity of a toppled strongman. Once adored, once cheered by crowds, once flanked by the incandescent presence of Evita, he now crept into exile aboard a Paraguayan gunboat, shuttled out, under military guard. His enemies called it liberation. His followers called it betrayal. But whether one wept or celebrated, no one doubted Argentina had entered a new chapter. The coup that toppled him styled itself the Revolución Libertadora, the liberating revolution. Its leaders promised to restore democracy, free speech, and normality. They also banned Peronism outright. Symbols, songs, even speaking his name became dangerous. Statues of Evita were hauled down, portraits ripped from classrooms, and her foundation dismantled. It was an attempted exorcism. They might as well have tried to ban tango, for Peronism, though outlawed, refused to die. Workers gathered in secret to toast his name. Graffiti scrawled on alley walls whispered, "Perón vuelve," Perón returns. Every attempt to erase him only deepened the mystique. Peronism became a forbidden faith, practiced in shadows, awaiting resurrection. Meanwhile, Argentina stumbled through years of coups and crises. Civilian governments clung to power only to be shoved aside by generals. Economic experiments flickered. Inflation roared back. Strikes, protests, and mutinies became the national soundtrack. And Perón? He observed from Madrid. Franco's Spain offered sanctuary, and from a villa on the outskirts of the capital, he played exiled statesman, dispensing advice, cultivating loyalists, and marrying again. Isabel Martinez, a nightclub dancer decades his junior. She lacked Evita's fire, but she became his companion and eventually, improbably, his political heir. In the 1960s, new tensions flared. Inspired by Cuba, young Argentines took up arms. The Montoneros, radical Peronists, imagined themselves as Evita's avengers. Bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations punctuated the decade, layering violence onto instability. By the early 1970s, the demand for Perón's return became irresistible. In 1973, after 18 years in exile, he boarded a plane for Buenos Aires. Millions flocked to Ezeiza Airport to greet him, only for joy to turn to horror. Rival Peronist factions, leftist Montoneros and right-wing loyalists, clashed violently. Gunfire, smoke, bodies on the runway. The Ezeiza massacre was a grotesque homecoming. Peronism literally at war with itself. Still, Perón reclaimed the presidency, sweeping the 1973 election. But he was no longer the vigorous colonel of the 1940s. Old, tired and ailing, he lacked the energy to master a fractured movement. In 1974, just a year after his return, he died. Argentina mourned. But without Evita's mythic aura, grief was muted. Power passed to Isabel, his widow. Her presidency was chaos incarnate. Ill-prepared, manipulated by advisers, she presided over a nation unraveling. Inflation soared, strikes spread, violence escalated. The Montoneros escalated their guerrilla war, while Isabel's government unleashed the AAA death squads. Assassinations, disappearances, and bombings turned Argentina into a battlefield. In March 1976, the militaries struck. Tanks rolled through Buenos Aires. Isabel was bundled away, and a junta declared itself in charge. They called their regime the Proceso de Reorganización Nacional, the National Reorganization Process. It sounded bureaucratic, as though the country needed filing cabinets. In truth, it was a reign of terror. The junta promised discipline, efficiency, and order. What they delivered was repression. Tens of thousands were swallowed by the machine of disappearance. The desaparecidos, the disappeared, became the symbol of the age. And here, let us pause on individuals, because numbers alone blur into abstraction. But Argentina's terror was lived by people with names. Take Azucena Villaflor, a housewife from Avellaneda. In 1977, after her son vanished, she began meeting with other desperate mothers. Together, they formed the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Each Thursday, they circled the square, white scarves on their heads, demanding answers. The junta noticed. Weeks later, Azucena herself was kidnapped, tortured, and thrown alive from a plane into the sea. Her body washed ashore, unrecognizable at first, later exhumed. She had become what she protested, a disappeared. Or Rodolfo Walsh, journalist, writer, and tireless critic of injustice. On the first anniversary of the coup, he published an open letter accusing the junta of mass killings, censorship, and economic ruin. The next day, he was ambushed by a death squad. He drew a pistol, resisted, and was shot dead. His body vanished. His words, smuggled abroad, lived on as testimony. Or consider the students of La Noche de los Lápices, the Night of the Pencils. In September 1976, secondary school pupils in La Plata who had marched for bus fare discounts were abducted. Some were just 16. They were tortured in secret prisons, accused of being subversives. Few survived. Their fate became one of the Dirty War's darkest symbols. Teenagers punished for daring to protest. Such stories were legion. Teachers, trade unionists, journalists, nuns, even the wrong neighbour, no one was safe. The vanished left behind grieving families and an atmosphere of suffocating fear. And yet, courage persisted. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo marched every week, scarves stitched with their children's names. They were mocked, harassed, even murdered, but they returned week after week. Their silence, their persistence, became Argentina's conscience. Meanwhile, the junta sought legitimacy. In 1978, Argentina hosted the World Cup. Stadiums roared as Mario Kempes scored and Argentina lifted the trophy. Flags waved, anthems soared, joy erupted. Yet prisoners in nearby torture centres heard the cheers from their cells. The juxtaposition was grotesque, national triumph masking national trauma. Economically, the junta embraced neoliberal reform. Factories shuttered, unemployment soared, foreign debt ballooned. Promises of modernization yielded only misery. By the early 1980s, discontent simmered. Then the final gamble, the Falklands War. In April 1982, Argentine forces seized the Islas Malvinas. For a moment, the nation rallied. Crowds sang, newspapers screamed victory. But Britain's response was swift, overwhelming. Within weeks, Argentina was defeated. The illusion of competence evaporated. By 1983, the junta crumbled. Raúl Alfonsín won democratic elections. Argentina returned to civilian rule. Trials of junta leaders began. Democracy, fragile and flawed, was restored. But the scars of the dirty war ran deep. 30,000 disappeared, families broken, truths hidden, memories raw. When Raúl Alfonsín raised his hand in victory in 1983, Argentines cheered not just a politician, but the return of democracy itself. After years of dictatorship, fear and silence, the ballot box once again mattered. People sang in the streets, waved flags, and for the first time in a generation felt that Argentina might be able to breathe freely. Alfonsín had inherited a nation traumatized. Families still searched for their desaparecidos. The economy was battered. Institutions were fragile. But he promised two things: justice and renewal. Trials began against members of the military junta, unprecedented in Latin America. Generals who had once ruled with impunity now sat in courtrooms, accused of crimes against humanity. For victims' families, it was a glimmer of accountability, though the process was fraught and incomplete. Still, the principle was set. Argentina would not forget. Economically, however, the 1980s proved merciless. Inflation galloped, debts mounted, and hopes of prosperity dimmed. By the end of the decade, bread prices could soar between breakfast and dinner. Argentines developed a grim humour about it. You got paid in the morning and rushed to the shop before your salary lost its value by lunchtime. In 1989, amid economic chaos, Carlos Menem took office. A flamboyant figure with Elvis-style sideburns and a taste for Ferraris, Menem represented a very different Argentina. He embraced neoliberalism, privatizing state companies, pegging the peso to the dollar, and opening markets. At first it worked. Inflation collapsed, Stability returned, and Argentina seemed modern again. Shoppers filled malls, foreign investors poured in, and Buenos Aires glowed with confidence. But beneath the sheen lay cracks. Privatization left many unemployed, inequality widened, and dependence on foreign credit deepened. By the late 1990s, the system was tottering. In 2001, it collapsed spectacularly. Banks froze accounts, savings evaporated, unemployment soared. Argentines poured into the streets, banging pots and pans in the Cacerolazo. The president fled by helicopter from the Casa Rosada rooftop, a cinematic symbol of failure. It was one of Argentina's darkest economic crises, a moment when faith in politics seemed to shatter entirely. Yet Argentina, resilient as ever, rebuilt. In 2003, Nestor Kirchner, a relatively obscure governor from Patagonia, became president. He ushered in a new era of left-leaning populism, known as Kirchnerism. His government emphasized human rights, reopening trials against dictatorship figures, and reasserted state control in the economy. When his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, succeeded him in 2007, Kirchnerism became more than policy. It became a dynasty. Cristina presided over a boom fueled by soy exports, China's appetite for commodities, and expansive social spending. Poverty fell, cultural pride swelled, and Argentina regained confidence. But critics accused her of authoritarianism, economic mismanagement, and corruption. Her presidency became polarizing, adored by loyalists, reviled by opponents. Some saw Evita's spirit in her, fiery, uncompromising, glamorous. Others muttered about demagoguery. By 2015, Argentines opted for change, electing Mauricio Macri, a businessman promising market reforms and pragmatism. But his tenure was marked by economic turbulence, IMF bailouts, and renewed discontent. Inflation, Argentina's old nemesis, refused to vanish. In 2019, Cristina returned, this time as vice president to Alberto Fernandez, her chosen candidate. Together, they represented continuity of Kirchnerism, though their partnership was uneasy. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, battering an already fragile economy. Poverty and inflation soared once again. Argentines, weary of cycles, joked darkly that their economy was like tango, always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, with a lot of dramatic flourishes in between. And now, in the 2020s, Argentina has taken another sharp turn. Javier Milei, a libertarian economist with a chainsaw, sometimes literally as he waved one at rallies to symbolize cutting the state, captured public imagination with his radical rhetoric. He promised to dollarize the economy, slash bureaucracy, and smash the political establishment. Some hailed him as a savior, others as a dangerous experiment. In typical Argentine fashion, the debate was passionate, operatic, and filled with drama. What is clear is that Argentina remains a country of paradoxes. It is a land that once ranked among the richest in the world and has endured repeated crises. A land of dazzling culture, Borges, Piazzolla, Maradona, Messi, and of enduring political turbulence. A nation both European and Latin American, always wrestling with its identity, always reinventing itself. Yet through democracy, however fragile, it has endured. The memory of dictatorship remains a warning. the resilience of civil society remains a strength. Argentina today is not free of problems, far from it. But it is a democracy, a place where votes matter, where people march, shout, sing, and demand. The story of modern Argentina, from Alfonsine to Millet, is one of resilience in the face of crisis, reinvention in the face of failure, and stubborn hope in the face of despair. If the Dirty War was Argentina's nightmare, then the decades since have been its long, uneven awakening. And so we arrive at the end of Argentina's long and winding stories, at least for now. From the first cave painters of Patagonia to the vast dinosaurs that tramped here long before them. From Gauchos on the Pampas to generals in the Casa Rosada. From Evita's fur-wrapped speeches to Messi lifting a World Cup. What a saga it has been. A tale of splendour and heartbreak, of operatic politics and astonishing resilience. Argentina is at heart a land of contradictions. It is a country that can weep as though a saint has died when Evita passes at 33, and then turn to cheer with equal fervour when a striker scores in extra time. It can produce Borges, the labyrinthine master of literature, and Maradona, the mercurial genius of football, in the same century. It can build boulevards grander than Paris and then default on its debts with the same flourish. This duality has been the constant thread. Argentina has often been among the richest nations on earth, and just as often among the most crisis-ridden. It has been governed by soldiers, populists, radicals, technocrats, and occasionally all of them at once. It has embraced immigrants with open arms, while also struggling to define what being Argentine really means. It has looked to Europe for inspiration, and to the Pampas for identity. And yet, despite coups, crises, and collapses, Argentina endures. It is not just endurance in the sense of muddling through, but something more lyrical. An ability to remake itself, to rise again after each fall, to transform tragedy into tango, crisis into comedy, and despair into defiance. Where other nations might brood, Argentina often sings, shouts, or kicks a ball with sublime skill. Think of the Gaucho, once free on the plains, later immortalized in Martin Fierro. His life vanished, but his spirit endured in song, poem, and national myth. Or think of the Descamisados, flooding the Plaza de Mayo in 1945. Their children and grandchildren still carry banners with Perón's name. Or think of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who refused silence in the face of terror. The white scarves they wore have become an emblem for justice everywhere. Even Argentina's crises have a peculiar grandeur. Hyperinflation in the 1980s was not just misery, it was a national drama in daily installments, people rushing to shops before their pay lost value by the afternoon. The 2001 collapse was not just economic failure, it was helicopters on the Casa Rosada roof, pots and pans clanging like church bells, a people making noise because silence was no longer tolerable. And in culture, Argentina has been astonishingly rich. Borges and Cortázar in literature, Piazzolla reinventing tango, filmmakers like Pino Solanas capturing politics in cinema. In football, Maradona and Messi bookend a saga of brilliance that seems almost preposterous. Two of the greatest to ever touch a ball from the same nation within the span of a few decades. It is as if Argentina, denied stability in politics and economy, poured all its genius into art and sport. Of course, contradictions remain. Today, Argentina struggles with debt, inflation, and political polarization. Yet it also celebrates a World Cup win that brought millions into the streets, hugging strangers and weeping with joy. Life in Argentina, one suspects, will never be dull. Perhaps this is the essence of Argentina, a nation that refuses to settle for ordinary. Its history has been dramatic, sometimes tragic, often maddening, occasionally glorious, but never boring. Other countries may specialize in quiet continuity. Argentina specializes in turning history into theatre. And so, as you drift towards sleep, let Argentina's story settle in your mind. Picture the vast Pampas, the Gauchos' horse, the Casa Rosada glowing pink at dusk, a bandoneon sighing in a Buenos Aires cafe, a ball flying into the net at the Lusail Stadium in Qatar. It is a story of resilience, passion and contradiction, a story as haunting as Tango, and as unpredictable as extra time in a World Cup final. And here is the question to take with you into sleep. Was Argentina's greatest legacy its literature, its politics, its music, or its football? Or is it something less tangible, the stubborn art of always beginning again?